Hello, everybody. This is Brian Terrell, Managing Partner of BTerrell Group. Thank you for joining me for this edition of Office Hours with BTerrell, Mastering 1099s in Sage Intacct. In this presentation, we'll share best practices, tips and tricks, and key concepts around processing 1099s in Sage Intacct. Grab a seat and get comfortable. The webinar has just begun. BTerrell provides mid-market accounting and finance automation and has been doing so for over 27 years. We have 18 professionals working together to serve our client companies. 3 are Sage certified, Sage Intacct certified, and 5 are certified public accountants. And I'm excited to report one of our professionals is well on the way on their way to becoming our 4th Sage Intacct certified consultant. I have been a part of our firm every step of the way during those 27 years and enjoy the opportunities provided me both within our business but also within our industry. And when I'm not working in this business or spending time with my family, you can often find me leading rides for the Plano Bicycle Association. We have lots to cover on presenting 1099s in Sage Intacct, but before we begin, let me remind you of several upcoming events next week. In Nashville is Sage Intacct Advantage 2018. Many of you have registered for and will be attending Sage Intacct's marquee event for the end user community. Please look us up as we'll have 5 or 6 of our folks there to participate in the great educational opportunity this event always provides. Second, we hope you'll join us for another presentation on the field services module for Sage Intacct. We have entitled this presentation, Can Your Customers Connect with You 24/7? That's scheduled for Thursday, November 8th. And then on Thursday, November 15th, we'll be hosting the BTerrell 2018 Quarterly Release 4 Luncheon from 11 to 1 p.m. This time around, we'll focus on a quick review of Sage Intacct Advantage 2018 for those that could not attend. We'll preview year-end planning and processing procedures that are important for Sage Intacct end users. We'll enjoy a presentation from a business partner on the importance of maintaining data security in mid-market enterprises, which is always a topic of concern and top of mind. And then finally, we'll spend a bit of time updating you on significant improvements published to Sage Intacct in Quarterly Release 4, which goes live on November the 16th. Our objective today is to review how to process 1099s in Sage Intacct. We'll start with a refresher on Form 1099 compliance and why it is important. We'll discuss the important configuration options for 1099 compliance within Sage Intacct. We'll set up a 1099 eligible vendor in Sage Intacct, adjust that vendor's 1099 balance, and then we'll explore the reporting capabilities that Sage Intacct provides for presenting our compiled 1099 totals to the 2 stakeholders who depend on our compliance. The first stakeholder depending upon our compliance are the payees themselves, and then the second is the IRS. As always, we'll identify Sage Intacct tips and tricks throughout the presentation that will help us all better use this marvelous cloud-based accounting package, which I remind you is the only AICPA preferred mid-market accounting application on the market. Form 1099 is a tax return that requires no payment from the filer. We refer to this type of tax return as a tax information return or simply an information return. And there's lots of other information returns such as the Form W-2, the Form K-1, the Form 1098, and then the Form 1095-C, which you'll recognize as the form that gives us the details of our employer-provided health benefits that's just made its appearance in the last 2 or 3 years. Information returns and the Form 1099 in particular inform the IRS of payments made in the course of a trade or business to non-corporate payees. That phrase, made in the course of a trade or business, is key because personal payments are not included. In other words, when I go to the grocery store and buy a bag of groceries, I don't have to issue a 1099 to the grocery store. That's not made in the course of a trade or business. If somebody comes and mows my yard and I send them a check, I don't have to give them a 1099. Or when I go and get my car repaired at the auto repair shop, all of these payments are personal payments not made in the course of a trade or business. Certain payments that are made in the course of a trade or business are excluded, such as payments for merchandise, payments for utilities, payments for freight or storage, or even payments of rent when they're made to real estate middlemen like real estate agents or managers. And in addition, certain payees are excluded. Typically, corporate payees are excluded, and limited liability companies, which are really partnerships, are excluded if they're taxed as corporate taxpayers. It's not our job to intuit whether or not an LLC is a corporate taxpayer or not. In fact, it's not our job to guess at any payee's corporate status or business formation status. That's what we have the Form W-9 for. We send a Form W-9, our payee responds to that and gives us all the information that's required and for us to be able to correctly set them up as a vendor for 1099 compliance purposes. The Forms 1099 that are sent to the first group of stakeholders, the payees, are generally due on January 31st, but in some cases, based upon the box that's being completed or the form that's being completed, those forms to payees can be extended. The due date can be extended to 2/15, or it's not extended, it's just a later due date. It's not much later, 15 days. And so in general, though, payees are to receive our Form 1099s with a compiled total of payments that we made to them during the previous calendar year on or before January 31st. If we're submitting printed forms to the IRS, those forms are due by February 28th, plus a Form 1096, which is just a transmittal form. If we are submitting our forms to the IRS, the second group of stakeholders, electronically, we have an extended due date of March 31st. And we do that online using a portal called the Filing Information Returns Electronically portal. That title, Filing Information Returns Electronically, creates an acronym FIRE, F-I-R-E, and that portal can be found at fire.irs.gov. So that the due date for filing Form 1099s depends upon which stakeholder to whom we're providing them. And then in the second case, the IRS as the stakeholder, it depends upon whether we file them electronically or not. In fact, I mentioned that the electronic due date is March 31st, I think, for this year, because that date falls on a weekend. It's actually April 1st, 2019. I can be granted a pretty automatic 30-day extension on these dates by filing Form 8809. And there are big penalties associated with missing these due dates. I've listed them there on the screen, and they vary based on how large the filer is and how delinquent the filing is. So if I'm a filer that has just missed the due date by 15 days, maybe I get those payee forms in the mail on February 15th instead of January 31st, the IRS can fine me $50 per form. And that's $50 per form per stakeholder. So if I miss the whole filing requirement for the entire year, then I can be fined. I can be assessed a fine not only for the form that goes to the payee, but also the form that the IRS was expecting. And it's only for 30 days that that fine is $50. After 30 days and before August 1st, it goes up to $100. And then if I don't get it filed after August 1st or until August 1st or ever, it's $270 per form per recipient. Big fines, and they do have upper limits. I've listed them there. They're broken down by the size of the filer. A small to medium-sized business filer has an upper limit of $191,000, a big number still. Larger companies, and the IRS defines a larger company as any company with more than 5 million in annual revenue. So that's a lot of us, right? The upper limit there is $547,000. If I only miss it by 30 days, if I blow off the entire thing and I'm going to have more than $5 million in revenue, they can assess me up to $3.2 million. These fines can be filed or assessed not only for missing the due date, but also not filing electronically, because the IRS does require electronic filing if I have more than 250 forms that are due to them on February 28th or March 31st in that case because of electronics. So if you're wondering if the IRS ever enforces these rules, please jot down the URL that's on the screen. This will take you to a blog entry that I wrote in 2015 that gives the horror story that an actual customer of mine had for the 2012 filing year. The CFO of that company filed 450 returns on paper and had multiple mismatches between the tax ID number that was listed on the forms and the business name that was listed on the forms. And the IRS really hates that. They want there to be a strong correlation between what they have in their records for a tax ID number and what the name of the actual business name is. And so this particular customer had some mismatches on that. Plus, they filed their 450 returns on paper, and of course the IRS hates that. If you have 250 forms or more to file, then they must be submitted electronically. The long and short of it is the customer received a penalty assessment of $27,000. If I divide that by 450, that equals $60, which also happens to be equal to double the per form per recipient fine at that time of $30 per form per recipient. So it was a big deal. We were able to help them compile that information and get it and shore up the 1099 compliance processes within their office, and things have been much better since. There are multiple forms 1099, and Sage Intacct supports a lot of them, not all of them, but I've listed those that we do support on the screen there, including the form 1096. Sage Intacct will print a form 1096 for you. And the forms that Sage Intacct prints appear on the page, 2 forms per page. If I were to go to the IRS office and get some blank form 1099s, they'd be 1 form per page, and that wastes paper. So Sage Intacct has programmed the system so that it's going to print out 2 forms per page. And so you'll want to get your forms someplace other than the IRS office. And I've listed a website there, www.formsforintacct.com, which provides certified forms for use with Sage Intacct. And you'll need these whether you file electronically or not, because your initial group of stakeholders, the payees, you'll need to send them a paper copy. Okay. Setting up Sage Intacct for 1099s involves a multi-entity accounting environment. We're able to share master files such as accounts, customers, vendors, employees, departments, and other dimensions across the enterprise, as well as some of the other really great things that it does, because it has a great ability to account for multiple entities, such as saving time, in accessing entities I don't have to log in and log out. I can just switch from one entity to the other. I have continuously consolidated financial statements, and I can manage those inter-entity payments and the due to, due from loan balances that result from those. But as it relates to Form 1099s, I'm also able to keep track of vendor 1099 amounts by vendor by entity. So I can have a shared vendor record and use that record in multiple entities, but keep track of how much 1099 payments have been made to a vendor by entity, and that's key. But I have to turn that on. And I'm going to show you in a minute how to do that. It's a basic foundation step in a multi-entity environment for Form 1099 compliance. And it also reminds me that because Sage Intacct does a great job of inter-entity transactions, in other words, entity A can pay the bills for entity B and C. And when that happens, I have to remember that entity A is going to be writing the 1099 because entity A made the payment. But Sage Intacct handles all that very well for me. Also, I have to ensure, because I have a multi-entity environment, that each of those entities that are printing 1099s that they're sending to both pays and to the Internal Revenue Source have the correct business name and tax ID number, and these are set up in the entity record. And so I'm just going to pause a moment and remind you, if you have any questions as we're going along, please feel free to let me know what those are. But in the meantime, let's just take a look really quickly at this basic foundational step of setting up Sage Intacct to account for or print 1099 per vendor per entity. As it shows there on the screen, I've covered it up, but it did show on the screen that I go to company and admin and then subscriptions. And I scroll down to my multi-entity console configuration link. And then if I scroll down a little bit from there, I'll see 1099s. And this is the box that must be checked in order for the system to issue a 1099, a separate 1099 for every vendor per entity. And this is one of the great benefits of multi-entity accounting in Sage Intacct. To make sure I have the name and tax ID number correct, I'll want to go into company and set up and manage my entities. Let's just take a look at the first entity, which is listed there with the appealing name of Pound 10. And if I come down to about halfway, I can see that there's a checkbox that says enable the legal name and address on Form 1099 and Form 1096. So the legal name might be the name of the company as filed with the IRS, and we want to get the address correct there as well. And I'll just settle down here and type a little bit better. And once I get this done, then I have made it such that for this entity, every 1099 that is printed from this entity to a payee or to the IRS won't have this unappealing name of Pound 10. It will have a legal name that's going to match up with the records at the IRS. So I'll go ahead and save that, since it's a whole heck of a lot better. Oh, it just wants a legal country. Let me do that. All right, and then the last thing to look at on this page is the tax ID number. That's here. I noticed that this one appears to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Real tax ID numbers have 9 characters, so we'll add one there. This second tax ID field is for maybe a state number or some other number, and I'm going to go ahead and click Save here twice because I had that little message there. That's not a problem. All right, so we have gone ahead and shown that we can set up the system to create 1099 per entity per vendor, and we can also make sure that each entity has a legal name that matches with the IRS records in conjunction with the federal tax ID number. Sage manages lots of 1099 forms, as we noticed earlier, about 7 or 8 or 9 of those different 1099 forms. but it also has to manage the boxes on those forms, and many of those forms have a lot of boxes. And every vendor must be assigned a default form and box, a default form 1099 form and the box. And what that means after that assignment is made is that every 1099 eligible vendor will have assigned to every line of every bill that default 1099 form and box. And so that begs the question, what if every line in a bill is not subject to 1099 reporting? Remember, merchandise is not subject to 1099 reporting. So if I really want to have my records correct and not have a vendor bark at me at the end of the year or at January 31st next year when I send them a Form 1099, I might want to make sure and exclude uh, a, a line on a bill that is for services. It's also a line on a bill that I would probably code to a different general ledger account than I would for the services. So merchandise and services might be invoiced to me on the same bill, and I just want to be able to make sure that the services only are subject to 1099 reporting. Sage Intacct allows for that, and the solution is to enable what they call the 1099 flag override. But what if every line in a bill doesn't fit or in the default form and box? And that might also be something that would occur in the example that I provided. Maybe a firm is providing services to us as well as is our landlord, right? And so they're going to send us, or we're going to send them a payment for maybe for both services and for rent, and we might want to ensure that both of those make the 1099-MIC form, but they're going to end up in different boxes. So I need to be able to override that at the line level, and Sage Intacct allows for that, and they call that enabling the 1099 form and box override. So let's just take a moment to look at that right quick and how we might do that. First of all, I go to accounts payable and setup and configuration. And if I scroll down just a bit, not too far, I have an entire section devoted to 1099s. This first checkbox relates to overriding the line level assignment of a line to the Form 1099 default box that's been assigned to the vendor. In other words, this relates to that first use case where some of the bill may be subject to 1099 reporting and some of it may not, in the case of services and merchandise on the same invoice. This second box relates to the instance where we might have two different charges on a invoice that we're posting in accounts payable, and some of it goes to one box or form and box, and some of it goes to another. That might be in the case of where we have a landlord who's also providing some services to us. And so it's two simple check boxes here that are important, I think, to make if that situation is appropriate for you. And I'll just show you how it looks on a bill. I'll go ahead and I think that this particular vendor here is 1099 eligible. Notice down at the bottom, because I checked that first box, enable 1099 flag override, I can uncheck each of these lines, which means I can make an entire bill not subject to 1099 reporting. And if I show the details here, you'll see that the default box and form combination are already pre-filled for me. And so in this particular case, this might be a $5,000 services related invoice or related portion of an invoice. So I'm going to go ahead and then go to the second line. It's also subject to 1099 reporting. Maybe it's $10,000, but this is that rent payment I was talking about. And this is possible because of the second box that was being checked. And I could even have a third line on this invoice, $250, that might relate to, instead of, it might relate to office expense other. This one would have been, I guess, office expense rent. And so here we have a bill where we're making a payment ultimately when we pay this. And two of the three lines are subject to 1099 reporting, and those lines are going to different boxes. Okay, so it is by virtue of the fact that we've toggled the 1099 flag override and the 1099 form and box override settings in AP setup configuration 1099s. It'd be nice if we could, when we're entering those those AP bills, to have a shortcut that associates the general ledger account to the forms and boxes. In other words, it'd be nice if I could enter in legal expense as a general ledger account and it know that it's not going to be rent. Or if I entered rent as an expense account, it would know that it's not going to be miscellaneous payments. And unfortunately, Sage Intacct does not allow for that unless we enable account labels, which are essentially words that are related one-to-one to general ledger accounts. It's a feature of accounts payable, and it does, of course, require that Form 1099 or 1099 form and box override be checked. But what that allows me to do is print in a word like rent, and then have rent default to the correct form and box because we've made that assignment in advance. And I'll show you that in a moment. I will say that there is one exception to this, and that is Intacct has a feature that allows related companies to essentially decrease the time that it takes to post related party transactions. In other words, one party can, or one entity can send an invoice to another entity from accounts receivable for services that they might have provided that second entity, and Intacct will automatically post that accounts payable bill in that second entity. That's called intercompany bill back. And if that feature, intercompany bill back, is enabled, the account label function does not work for us here. If it is not enabled, it is a shortcut that we can take advantage of. Another nice to have shortcut might be to associate vendor types to forms and boxes. Vendor types are just groups, or excuse me, are just designations that are applied to vendors that we can then report on. So we could create a group of law firms, or we could create a group of inventory suppliers, and then run reports on that on those groups. But we can also create a group of 1099 eligible vendors. And when we do create that group, or any group, and assign a vendor to that group when we're setting it up, it's called a vendor type, not group. We assign that vendor type when we're setting up the vendor, then it will auto assign that vendor's form and box based upon the assignment of the form and box to the vendor type. And it's a lot of words, so maybe it's best to take a look at that right quick. Let's go first to check out where we set up account labels. That's in accounts payable under setup, and right here, account labels. We're going to leave this unposted bill behind, and notice that in our example we were talking about rent as a possibility. I think there is a rent one already set up here, right here. This is a word, and it's not a simple word. I probably would have just put rent in as opposed to office expense. But when that word rent is posted to or entered into an accounts payable line, then it will default to this account right here. So if I edit this, you'll notice that I'm able to click a Form 1099 link that's contained within, and then I could go ahead and set up the correct box and form combination for rents for this particular account label. Once again, it only works when we have when we're not using intercompany bill back. But otherwise, it's a time saver that might be helpful in those instances that we have one bill that's spread over multiple different forms and boxes. And it makes it automatic. Somebody doesn't have to remember to do that. Let's take a look at the other function that helps us with a little bit of time, and that's the vendor type that I mentioned that we could create. Let's go ahead and add one. We'll call this one legal. And once I save that and then come back in and edit it, I can notice that it also has a Form 1099 link that if I go in and I set it up correctly for the correct form and the correct box, then I'm all set up for adding a new vendor with and assigning that vendor to this type, and then having all of the different configuration options established correctly for this particular vendor. And we'll show that here in just a moment. Now we have a properly configured system, Sage Intacct system for 1099s. We've laid the groundwork for the multi-entity considerations by enabling one 1099 per entity per vendor. We've made sure that we have the correct name and tax ID number for each entity. We've enabled form and box override at the line level in nearly in every situation, and we create a couple of shortcuts to speed up our processing via account labels and vendor types. So we're ready now to add a vendor for 1099 processing and make that vendor 1099 eligible and assign the correct form and box default. And if there's an initial balance or take on balance, 1099 balance, we want to add that as well. Vendors who are properly set up for 1099 processing have some or all of the boxes that you see on the screen encircled in yellow completed. And all of this action occurs on the additional information tab of the vendor master. The additional information tab doesn't always look like this. This is what it looks like only when I'm adding a vendor and haven't saved it yet. There's three different looks to the additional information tab in this section. This one for at vendor addition time, but when I'm going back to a vendor that has no assignment, it looks a bit different. And then when I go back to a vendor that has an assignment, meaning an assignment of a 1099 form and box, it even looks different. In fact, I think I've drawn a picture here of these three options. It's kind of confusing, but when I'm adding a vendor for the first time, I will either need to visit the vendor type and give it that vendor type that's associated with a form and box combination, or I'll need to check the box 1099 eligible and enter in the information that it will ask for subsequent to that. If I'm going back to an unassigned or ineligible vendor for 1099 purposes, it'll look like that second screenshot there. It does have the form 1099 link, but there's nothing that's above or below it that gives any additional information. And then finally, if I have an assigned eligible vendor, it'll look like what you see at the bottom. And in this particular case, this vendor, which I've entitled Form Testers Company, has not only a 1099 name that's probably different than their marketing name, but also have a box and form combination that will default for every vendor or to every bill line item in every bill that is added. So these are the three different looks that you might see at that stage of the vendor setup process. Other considerations that we need to consider when setting up a vendor for 1099 processing include the the requirement and the emphasis that the IRS places on the tax ID number matching the name that's on the 1099, and often we are setting up vendors based upon their marketing name. They may have signed a contract with us or send us an invoice with a name that's really not the name that they originally established their business or their tax ID number with the IRS under, and that happens a lot. And so Sage Intacct provides a field for the 1099 name, and they named it appropriate, and it's called 1099 name. The other consideration when we're adding a vendor is that if we're adding a vendor sort of maybe as a part of a conversion or after we've made a payment, we'll want to adjust that 1099 balance, and this gives us an opportunity to do it not only at the time that we add the vendor, but even later if we were to need to make a change in the total because of an error that was made during posting, we can just go in and make that change. And I'll show you this in a minute. And then all of this data can be imported. We can certainly import vendors, and when we do, we can import those form and box assignments as well as that 1099 name. We can also import those opening balances, which are assigned not only to a vendor but also to that to a vendor for a certain entity, for a certain form, and for a certain box. And then we can also import updates to transactions, which is important when I've paid a bill and I can't go back and change any of the entry to it. I might need to make it 1099 eligible, or I might need to change the form and box combination. I can do that through importing and a transaction update, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and just go through the process of setting up a vendor. I'm going to rely on or call this vendor, or I'm going to tell you the story that this vendor is a this is a vendor who's called me up and said, hey, we're going to go and collect some overpaid sales tax that you have remitted, and we call our company Fast Cash Now Inc., and that's just their marketing name. They also have an address here really close to us on Beltline Road here in Dallas. And these are the important fields for this particular demonstration. Remember, all the action for 1099 occurs on additional information, and it will only look like this in this area the first time that before I save the vendor. And I'm going to, because this is a legal firm that has called and made this offer for us, I'm going to go ahead and choose the vendor type ID legal. I'm going to go ahead and click Save. Now that's done a lot of work for me behind the scenes, but it hasn't done it all because I didn't really think it all through. So let me think it all through and go back to that tab and notice that this is the important thing that it did do, which was create the default form and box assignment for me. But it didn't enter in my 1099 name, and I got that from the Form W-9, and this particular law firm is named One and Done LLC, and they've identified themselves as a firm that is a non-corporate LLC, so that they need a 1099. Notice that when I click the Form 1099 link, it gives me an opportunity to fill in an entity name, and that's my entity, number 10 there. And then it would give me a chance to go in and add a value to catch me up for a balance that I might have, for a payment that I might have made that I did not get recorded before I set up the vendor. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And what we've just done here is not only added a vendor, but we used a vendor type to speed up the process a bit. We've appropriately entered the One and Done LLC as the 1099 name, and we added an initial balance of $10,000 so that if I wanted to, I could print a 1099 to them right now for the year, I think I said 2017. in the amount of $10,000. But I do need a tax ID number, so I'm going to go ahead and take a look at that that W-9 to get that, and I'm going to click. Well, I'm going to click Save here, and go back in one more time and make sure that I put in that take on balance for 2017. The reason I need it to be 2017 instead of 2018 is that 2018, I can't print a 1099 yet for 2018. I can only print a 1099 in Sage Intacct for 2017. It'll probably be around the time that the quarterly release 4 is published that we'll begin to be able to print 1099s for 2018 on a pro forma basis in order to check our totals. All right. So now we've set up a vendor, and we will then segue back to our presentation. I notice that we have about 15 minutes left. So we're going to take a look at some of the reports, answer a couple of questions, and we'll be able to finish on time. Sage Intacct creates or outputs our Form 1099 data in essentially 4 different formats. It'll create that Form 1096 for us, which is the transmittal that goes on top of the forms that we mail in to the IRS. For the supported forms, it prints the Form 1099, and we support 7 or 8 of those forms, and those are the most typical forms. And it also prints reports that we can use throughout the year. We don't have to wait till November to print these reports to see what our 1099s would look like and the detail that make up that data. And then we can also export the data if we decide to heck with it. We don't want to be in the Form 1099 printing business. We want to outsource that. And so I want to take a look at that now and just show you some of these reports. Alrighty, I'm going to go back to my vendor, and I believe we saved all of this, so we don't have to save it again. And got a lot of vendors here. Fast Cash Now is the last vendor that was added, so it's there at the bottom of the page. And this particular view does not help me understand the status of all these vendors for Form 1099 eligibility. And one of the ways that I can make a view that provides me with that information is to utilize the ability that Sage Intacct has to create custom views. So let's do that right quick, just to give us a picture of only those 1099 eligible vendors. So I'm going to go ahead and pick the 1099 name, the 1099 type, the 1099 box, and then there's a tax ID number in here somewhere. There it is. That's important for me. I'm going to get rid of city, state, and zip, and then I'm going to go to the next item in the wizard, and I'm going to filter for this view only those vendors that have a 1099 box. That's the number that's greater than or equal to 1, because the lowest box number could be less than 1. And then I want to sort the whole list in ascending order. And then I'd like to save this view. Oops, I got to give it a name. And I'll call it, where am I here? 1099 status. And I already had this set up, so I'm going to call this one status 2. What this does is it gives me a quick look at my 1099 eligibility across all my vendors. Oh, I failed to do one thing, I think, which is filter this view for the box number, but I thought I did that. Let's just go through. Maybe I lost it when I didn't save it the first time. Okay, so that's not working, but I'll take a look at the one that is working, which I set up just exactly like this. This is the one that filters this list for only those vendors that have 1099 eligibility. And you can see that I'm missing tax ID numbers for a couple of my vendors and names for a couple of my vendors, but otherwise I've got all my ducks in a row. So that's sort of a report, but not really the reports that I wanted to show you around 1099 reporting, just a tip or trick that might help you in managing all this data. The Form 1096 is the transmittal that we can go ahead and print for an entity on an entity basis, and we'll go ahead and try that out right quick for Form 1099 MISC. We should have one in 2017 because we just added one and done. And it wants to create some suspense there. But okay, so here's our 1099 transmittal, and that seems to be working. Let's go ahead and go back and print a 1099 form for the year 2017 for Entity 10 and see if we get the information we're expecting. I think this is helpful because what it shows is that we've got the 1099 name as well as the marketing name. And the IRS is hungry for identifying characteristics when it's vouching for payments. So we've given them all the information that they need, including our own name and our tax ID number, as well as one and done's tax ID number. The other report that I wanted to show you right quick is the 1099 report that gives us the information for a prior year, I guess. Let's go ahead and take a look at all of the transactions that are 1099 eligible for the prior year for the 1099 miscellaneous form for the entity pound 10. And as far as I know, we might only have one. And that's our fast cash. Now, if we'd made if we'd written some checks and against invoices that were posted, it could be that those invoices were 5 years old, but the payments were made in 2017. We'd have a list of all those payments here so that we could figure out what is the basis for the total that's appearing on that particular vendor's 1099. And then finally, if we wanted to say to heck with it, and we don't want to be in the 1099 printing business, we can go ahead and create a quick download of our 1099 information. And then we can, oops, I don't want to do that. And then we can go ahead and upload that form to any different outsourcing providers for this particular service and have them print and mail our 1099s. When that comes up here in a minute, I'm going to go ahead and show that to you. Right, we didn't have much going on this year, but there's the data that we just entered for the vendor that we just entered, putting $10,000 in box 7, and then it's got our information out to the right over here. This might equal the format that's required by the 1099 outsourcing provider that you select, but usually those formats are pretty easy to adjust to. All righty. Let's talk about some problems that we run into around 1099 processing. Often I'll have a 1099 amount that's just plumb wrong. I mean, one and done showed that they had $10,000, and they are calling me up now on February 5th and saying you've overstated that number. It should have been $5,000 because $5,000 was for merchandise or something like that. So how do I manage that? Well, for sure, I can go in to one and done and make a quick change to their Form 1099 total in the same way that I set up that initial balance. And this is the easiest, quickest way to make that change. Let's go to additional information, Form 1099. Make sure that I have the correct entity and year combination. I believe we said that that was 2017. And come down and just change this number. And this is a number that affects a balance that has been compiled based on payments. In this particular case, this vendor didn't really have any payments, so this is the balance. But I could put in a negative number here if I had $6,000 in payments, and they said I only should be 1099 eligible for 5. I could put a negative number in there, and this instantly changes the balance. So this is the quickest way to make a change when you run into a problem on one particular vendor's total. What about a vendor bill that's missing from the report? I need to, first of all, make sure that that vendor has a form and box default that's been assigned to them for a certain 1099 year. And if it hasn't, then I need to make that assignment and then enter the missing amount in the box in the same way that we did for one and done. If it has been assigned, then I need to ensure that on the bills that I've paid, that the 1099 box on the bill was checked, because that box can be unchecked by anyone. But if it's been assigned and if that box was checked, then I need to make sure that that payment was made in the 1099 report year that I am reporting on. It's not the bill posting year, it's the bill payment year. And then the final thing that I'd check is, does the total exceed $600 or $599? Because Intacct will not print or include, for 1099 compliance purposes, any vendors for which an accumulated payment total is less than $600. What if I've just learned that a vendor was not made 1099 eligible ever, and we've written a bunch of checks? So first of all, I want to go in and make them eligible by going to additional information and assigning them a default box and form. If there are unpaid bills there, then it will give me the option of going back and changing the assignment of those bills based upon the changes that I just made on the additional information tab. But most of the time, all of these bills have been paid, and it's not going to go back and update a paid bill. These facts are found way after the fact, and so I will have to then consider updating my paid bills for a range of time. If it's the 2017 year, then I'm going to go back and update all the bills in 2017 with the correct form and box combination. I can do that from a spreadsheet. Let me show you where we obtain that spreadsheet. That spreadsheet is obtained under Company Import Data. I'm going to go ahead and leave here. I'm going to scroll down to the AP. It says area which says Vendor 1099 Transaction Update. I'd first want to download the template. I'd want to fill it in, and then I'd want to come back here and import it. It'll go back to paid bills and reassign them the correct form and box combination. It'll also add a correct 1099 name if that's missing. Okay, I've just learned that a bill that I've paid, or a whole lot of paid bills, should be made 1099 eligible. That's exactly what we just talked about. We have to go to that very place that we import data for setup purposes, usually when we're converting to Intacct. Download that Vendor 1099 Transaction Update template, fill it in, and then import that template. So I can really cure a lot of problems with that feature. Okay, I've been told that my employees should receive 1099s, and there really is no such thing as a 1099 employee. Folks that we pay for services rendered to our companies are either employees or independent contractors. And by the way, misclassifying employees as independent contractors creates tremendous heartache for everyone involved. And the IRS has issued guidelines in publication 15-A to keep us on the right side of the ditch in that particular scenario. But an employee who receives payments for services that are separate and distinct from his employee role might receive a 1099. For instance, if I was a great piano player and I decided to play the piano at the Christmas party for $1,000, and the company paid me for that, and I was also an accountant that worked there. They have all my W-2 wages on all my accounting wages on the W-2, but my piano uh, income would come to me on a Form 1099. And Sage Intacct does allow for 1099s to be issued on employees, very much in the same way that it does for vendors. Alrighty, I'm going to see if. Thank you again for joining us for this edition of Office Hours with BTerrell. For more information about BTerrell Group or Sage Intacct, please browse to bterrell.com, where you'll find lots of ways we can connect. Have a great day.